Suzie Woodrich, and I am the daughter of my father, who's going to be interviewed now. And would you please tell us your name?
I'm Stephen Brown Woodrich.
And would you tell us, maybe spell it?
Woodrich.
Your unit?
I was with Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment, 10th Division.
And your rank?
I was a PFC.
And what were your dates of service?
I went in April of '44 and was discharged in February of '46.
First off, could you please tell us what was it that caused you to get involved in the 10th Mountain Division?
I was a student in a private boys' school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Blake School, and one of the fellows that had graduated a couple years ahead of me, who was a member of the 10th Mountain Division, came back to Blake School and gave a talk in front of the school telling about Camp Hale and the mountain troops, and that made me interested because I wasn't sure just what I wanted to do. I was pretty sure I wanted to go into the Army because I'd been to a couple of military schools before I went to Blake. And after his talk, I went up and asked him how I could get in, and he told me that I needed to get 3 letters of recommendation, and he gave me the address to send them to Minnie Dole, and I did so.
And when did you tell us about where you were at that time in your life?
Well, I was just, it was just before I was to graduate. I had accelerated my senior year because so many of our class were being drafted before they could finish their senior year, and I got out in December, graduated, and waited for the greetings from Uncle Sam, and I was called in at the first part of April.
And where did you go?
Well, they sent me down to a camp in Texas, Tyler, Texas, Camp Fannin, for my 17 weeks of basic training. And after that was completed, because I had proof or a letter saying that they would accept me in the 10th Mountain Division, I was transferred to the 10th at Camp Swift, Texas, which is near Austin, Texas. They had left Camp Hale to get flatland training, so I missed any instruction in the mountain areas.
So what were your dates for training?
Well, I started 17 weeks for basic training, and then down at Camp Swift 4 months later, after I'd entered, I joined F Company in the 86th Mountain Infantry.
At training, during training, what was one of your most memorable experiences there?
Well, when I first joined Fox Company, my squad leader was Danny Phillips, one of the best mountaineers in the 10th. And one of my first assignments was to go work with the new mules that were coming in from, I guess, Missouri. I'd had no experience with mules, and it was a trying experience because they were stubborn, and I was only 18 years old and weighed about 145 pounds, and these mules were bigger than horses. And I was there 2 or 3 days, and then I was kicked by one of them in my arm, and they didn't know if my arm was broken or not, so they sent me over to the dispensary or the hospital, and there I ran into a fellow that had graduated from the same high school I did and was from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and that was a pleasant surprise. After, my arm was not broken, but when from that point on, they didn't send me back to the mules. I was in a regular rifle squad and went out on problems with the 10th.
What was it like coming into a group that had trained in Camp Hale and you weren't at that training, but you went to Camp Swift. What was it like?
Well, they were very friendly. They didn't. There was a certain camaraderie among those guys that had trained so long together, but there were a couple other fellows that had come in that hadn't been at Camp Hale, and we were accepted very readily, and they were very nice to us.
Following training, when did you go over to Italy?
Well, after I'd had a furlough about in the latter part of November, the 86th shipped out, and we went to Hampton Roads near Newport, and we got on a ship, the Argentina, the 86th entire regiment, and we landed in Naples, Italy, just before Christmas. And we were only there a day or two when they decided they wanted to ship our regiment up to Livorno because the Gothic line was being pressed by the Germans in a certain area, and as soon as we got there, after a day or two, we were put right into the front lines.
And can you tell us what exactly was your responsibility when you got over there?
Well, I was part of a rifle squad. I was a #1 scout, and but during a lot of the campaign, the scouts were just like riflemen. But later on, the scouts were out in front and were the eyes of the platoon if they were up in the point. And I lasted through until the end of the war as the #1 scout.
And you were part of which division?
Well, I was in the in Fox Company of the 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment. My company commander was Percy Rideout, who had been assistant Dartmouth ski coach before he joined the 10th, and was a good leader.
Can you talk a little bit about the specific battles you were involved with, starting with Riva Ridge?
Yeah. Well, after we'd been on the front above Pisa, they took us back and got us ready for the climb on Riva Ridge. And I think it was February 18th, they took us by truck. When it was dark, we unloaded at the foot of Riva Ridge, and they put us in some houses that were in the valley. And we stayed there hidden until a day later, when it turned dark, we started the climb up Riva Ridge. F Company was in the 2nd Battalion, and the first 4 companies of the 1st Battalion, Abel, Baker, Dog, and Charlie, were on our right. We were on the extreme left of the climb on Riva Ridge. And we got up on top and surprised the Germans, had a firefight. It was very cold up there. All we had were K rations and ammunition. And we had to stay there about 3 days. Our K rations froze, and it was, we were looking to be relieved, but the Mount Belvedere battle had started, and so it was 2 or 3 days we were up on top of Riva before we were able to come down.
And the people you were with, how did that all fare?
Well, F Company was very fortunate. The part of Riva Ridge that we went up didn't have too many casualties. We were counterattacked by the Germans, and we caught them with our machine guns and kept them from getting up to where they could take the Riva Ridge back from us. A couple of days after, or a day or so after we'd been up on top, we heard what was going on over on Mount Belvedere, and there was a lot of heavy fighting going on over there.
After Riva, what were your thoughts personally after dealing with that first?
Well, after Riva Ridge was over and Mount Belvedere had been taken, they took us back to the rear areas, and as I remember, they were getting us ready for the push and march, and I think we had a little R&R in Montaigne, and then the early part of March, they started another push further into the Gothic line. And we got our first casualties from mortar fire and 88 fire. I know our assistant squad leader got hit right. He was Charlie Berry from Philadelphia. He was a Princeton student, had been drafted, and he didn't rejoin us until the summertime. And that battle in March was, there were a lot of close calls for everybody. I remember one time we were marching along a mountaintop next to some mules, and some 50 caliber bullets came across the valley from machine guns that the Germans were firing, and they didn't hit any GIs, but they hit a mule in the rear end, and the blood came out just like a fountain, and the mule just sunk and collapsed. Of course, all of us were in a ditch, and we were lucky that the mule got hit instead of any of us. And I remember one day in that push in March where I think I dug 6 foxholes that day, and we usually, there were 2 of us working together. There was a rifleman named Harold Singer. He and I always were paired up, and we were digging a foxhole on this forward slope, and our squad leader, Weir Stewart, noticed that some mortars were coming in right around us, and he says, "I think I better move you on the other side of the knoll, or the mountaintop." And just as we pulled back up to go on the other side, a mortar hit right where we'd been digging, so that was a lot of luck there. But
were you able to write home at all about any of these experiences?
During the battle, we didn't write home, but between battles, we had plenty of time to write letters, and I know after Riva Ridge, I wrote a letter to my folks. I thought I better thank them for all the good things they'd done to me, because I wasn't too sure I was going to be coming back in one piece. And this was a letter in a blue envelope, and my mother got it, and I should have probably not written a letter, because she went to pieces for about a week. But I had a brother who was in the South Pacific, who was attached to the Marines, so she had another guy to worry about beside me. But other than that, yeah, we wrote letters when there was time.
Can you talk a little bit about the April campaign?
Yeah, after the March campaign, they sort of stopped us because I think the rest of the line wasn't ready to push off, and we about the first part of April, they pulled us back up, and we could tell that there was going to be some action. I remember just about the time that Roosevelt died, they had a special religious service for us. They had the Catholic priest and the rabbi and the Protestant minister there, and we knew that this was particularly, it was telling us what was coming. And I know as scouts they gave me plenty of morphine tubes in case somebody needed help, had been hit. And we jumped off on April 14th, and we were headed toward this Rocca Rufino, which was a very high hill, mountain. And as a lead scout with Weir Stewart, my squad leader, next to me, and the platoon leader behind us, we got down, I suppose, within 150 yards of the Rocca Rufino when Weir got hit in the neck with a bullet and told me to hit the ground, which I did, and our platoon leader was shot through the head and killed, Triquel, and our BR man was hit and wounded, so he never rejoined us. We had 49 casualties that particular day out of our company, which was probably about 170 guys. 11 were killed and 38 wounded. Our company commander got a bullet through the cheeks, so he was out until the war was over. And that was a tough day. And we were pinned down by machine gun fire, mortar fire, 88s, and it was heavily mined through there too. And I remember at the tail end of that day, there was so many wounded there. I helped carry one of the fellows who was badly wounded back to the aid station. We were supposed to have Italian Alpini to help us, but they'd all taken off. And I know the fellow there were 3 other guys helping to lift. This guy was a big guy. And we got him back there, but he died at the aid station. But then I rejoined my company. I slept a little bit, and then I went right back up the front and was able to join my squad again.
What date was that?
That would be like April 15th. And then we had a steady push, but we had firefights. I remember one time going up a hill, we were spread out, and a German threw a phosphorus grenade out, which landed just a few yards from me and exploded. But when I hit the ground, I didn't know what had happened. I knew there was a grenade, but I was okay. And one of the soldiers from New York, who had been a replacement, Mike Achilles, he was going to shoot the German. And I said, no, he's just about 17 years old. I guess he was a kid. And he was trying to surrender then after he'd thrown the grenade. And we sent him back to the rear. And I don't know what the Italians did with him. Another episode during that push to get to out of the Apennines, I was riding a tank with Harold Singer and John Miller, my squad leader. But this was my second squad leader. And a Panzerfaust went right over the tank that we were riding on, but it missed the tank. And one of the guys in the tank, I think he hit the guy that had shot the Panzerfaust. We continued down the road. One day we got to a point where they stopped us. We had been behind another company, I guess, and as we pulled up, I was chosen along with a couple other guys to go back and load dead GIs into body bags, and we were going to load them on Jeeps so they could take them to the rear. And that was sort of an unusual experience, picking up dead GIs with rigor mortis. And I didn't know any of them. They were from a different company. We went through some small towns on the way before we got to the Po Valley, and the people gave us eggs and wine and flowers, and then all of a sudden we saw the Po Valley, and then we were all sort of worried about what it was going to be like to fight in the flatlands after having fought in the mountains for about 3 months. But as we came out of the Po Valley, out of the Apennines, our company did not, were not the first ones across the Po River. And when we got there, I think we were able to cross on a bridge. And but then, by that time, I think Colonel Darby, of the former head of Darby's Rangers, took over as our regimental commander, and we left the artillery behind us, and they put us on trucks, and we were accompanied by the 1st Armored Division, some of their tanks, and we would go a certain number of miles, hell-bent for election, and the air cover was mostly, it was all American planes. We didn't see any German planes, but sometimes we would go so fast that the American planes that were flying would thought we were Germans. We had maybe some German vehicles that we picked up that were in our convoy, and our guys that were up in front would throw these grenades, different colored grenades out, trying to indicate that we were part of the 10th Mountain Division up going north. And but sometimes they would come down and strafe us, and we'd head for the ditch, which was a lot of cussing going on. But as we went north, we would run into opposition in certain small communities. Of course, the Italians were all out of them normally. I remember one time going up this street, and the Germans were in houses, and we waited, called for tank help, and we get a tank up there from the 1st Armored, and they'd put a shell or two into the house, and then you'd see the white flags come out and the Germans surrendering. I remember this one town, we got up toward the north end of the town, and here came a German Mercedes around the corner with it was a convertible, with a couple of officers, German officers, and I suppose they were coming down to this building that we had just had a firefight with the Germans, and one of them jumped out and was ready to shoot, and we all fired at them, and then they surrendered. But it was a very fast-moving convoy. I think we went through the Po Valley in just about a week or maybe less. We got to Verona, and there was some firefighting going on in Verona, but another division had come in to help in Verona. I think it was the 85th or the 88th Division, and the Germans had pretty much left Verona by the time we got came through the rail yards that were all demolished. And there was a false report that the war was over, and boy, we were all so excited. And then pretty soon, about an hour later, they said, that's all false, you're heading north. And so we got in the convoy again, and we ended up in the south end of Lake Garda. And of course, some of the time we were on foot. And at the south end of Lake Garda, we ran into a lot of trouble from the Germans. They were mining the tunnels, and some of the GIs that were the first ones in had been killed. I remember there was one officer in the tank who refused to drive his 1st Armored tank into the tunnels, and I don't know what happened to him because he was disobeying orders. But we were told that we were waiting for some ducks that had been used to cross the Po River. And as we were waiting there, Baker Company of the 1st Battalion came through where we were, and I'll be darned if Dwight Williams, he was a buck sergeant in Baker Company, didn't look me up, and that was the first time I'd seen him since I'd seen him on the Argentina. And he said that they were going to climb through the mountains on the east side of the tunnels. I told him we were going to go by ducks around the tunnels. And the next morning, I don't know how many ducks there were, but a duck held about 30 men. And there were quite a few of them, and we started around. One of them, it wasn't lucky. They swamped, and a number of all except one, I guess, except one of the soldiers drowned. But 88s were coming in at our ducks, but we were able to get to the north end, and we had a new platoon leader who, for a long time there, we'd gone without a platoon leader because Lieutenant Trickell had been shot through the head. But we received a new platoon leader from St. Louis who'd won the DSC at Casino. And he came over and joined the 86th, at the same time Darby took over the regiment. And he was gung-ho. He had a Thompson submachine gun, but he let us. We cleaned out Turboli and Riva, and then the war ended on about the 30th of April. This lieutenant from St. Louis shot some Germans that were surrendering, and there was a inquisition later to see what had happened, but he was acquitted, and he said that the Germans had tried to run away, which we didn't think was right, but that's what happened. That was the only experience I saw like that in World War II.
Did you deal with any of the Germans yourself, them surrendering, or did you speak German?
Well, yes. Well, a number of times, any prisoners, but when I first joined the 86th, it must have been in that March push. We had a couple hundred Germans that had surrendered, and I was picked out along with a few other GIs to march them back to the rear, because I guess maybe because I could speak a little German. I'd had 4 years in high school of German, and I wasn't fluid, but I was better than the average guy. But the Jerrys were ready they had their arms up, and of course, there were so few of us, if they'd wanted to do something, I think they could have overcome us, but that's about all I remember about prisoners.
Did you get injured at all?
No, I ran into a barbed wire fence and had a cut knee, but I had no Purple Heart. I had 2 Bronze Stars, one at Riva Ridge and one on April 14th. I got a nice commendation on what had happened on April 14th from an officer. I think it was written up by our squad leader, our second squad leader, John Miller, because I didn't get the commendation until June, I guess it was. But it was dated April 14th. So everybody deserved a medal. I guess it was just who saw you, but there were some fellows that had done better things or more bravery, and there were a few Silver Stars, I think, in our company.
Following Lake Garda, what happened?
Oh, yes. After Lake Garda, well, our platoon leader, this one that had shot these Germans, he volunteered us to go up and climb up in the Alps looking for some SS troops that were supposed to be there. So we were up there a day or two trying to march around. Nobody was very happy about that because the war was supposedly over. But we did not run into any opposition from any SS troops. And after we came back, they took us by truck. We were there for a few days in the Riva area. I remember I had to stand guard one night, and things were pretty loose, though. I know they called out the guard, and hardly anybody was there, which would have been bad news before the war ended. But and we were criticized and censored for it. But after the Riva, they took us down to near Milan, and I remember they brought us a lot of cognac and champagne and beer, and we all had a party. That was the first time I'd ever been inebriated, and I was sicker than a dog. But while we were there, two things that I remember. One, General Alexander came through on a visit. He was the supreme commander of all the forces in Italy. He was the head of both the 5th Army and the 8th Army, and he came down and talked to our, I don't know, it was a couple of platoons, and we shook hands with him. He said we were the horse and he was the jockey. I knew he was an important guy, but I didn't know he was the head of the entire Italian campaign. He and Mark Clark had their differences because Mark Clark disobeyed Alexander coming out of Anzio. But another thing that happened that I remember, one of our replacements made a terrible mistake. he went into the tent to clean his BAR, and one of the other replacements was sitting in there. The other replacement had been with the 34th Infantry Division for extended period, and he was just sitting there, and the replacement that was cleaning the BAR made a mistake, and as he pushed the cartridge in and pulled the trigger, the bullets came out and shot and killed the other soldier that was sitting across from him in the tent. And they transferred that soldier, fined him $1, and gave him a carton of cigarettes. I never saw him again. And today, last night and today, I sat with George Metzenbaum, who was a third squad leader in our platoon, and he remembered this episode real well. It was a terrible thing that this guy had been on the 34th, that had a lot of days in the line too, a lot more than any 10th Mountain men, because the 34th had been in the line 600 days, longer than any other division in the United States Army. And this guy had already served a long period before he came into us as a replacement. Well, after, just at that time, we were alerted that we were going to be moved over to the Yugoslav-Austrian border to replace the British. The British were having trouble with the Yugoslavs, and so they took us by truck over there, and we were near the small town of Villach. And we didn't have too much trouble, except a few of the GIs got a little bit wind up, and the Yugoslavs had women in their army, and there got to be a small firefight between the GIs and the Yugoslavs, mostly because of the women, I think. So they made us turn in all our pistols, and so I had 4 pistols that I'd taken off German officers. I turned 2 of them in. I figured that at least I wasn't going to trust them with 4, and sure enough, when I came back to come home from the States, those 2 that I turned into the supply sergeant, they were gone, but I had 2 that I were able to take. But after that episode, it was very plain that we weren't to go in that town in Villach, I guess it was, at the same time Yugoslavs, and there were no more incidents. But this was in June. My first squad leader, Weir Stewart, who had been shot through the neck, rejoined us, and there was another guy in Fox Company, Harry Willis, and Weir and Harry and I climbed this mountain. It took us all day to climb the mountain. It was in the Alps, and we went up the mountain fairly slowly, and there was snow up on top. And then we did some glissading there, which I wasn't very good. I probably was out of control, and they grabbed me so I wouldn't go over. And but then we came down. But Harry and Weir were very good mountain climbers, and after the war was over, they were commissioned by Saturday Evening Post to climb in the Tetons and write an article for Saturday Evening Post, which they did, and were paid for it. And I have a copy of the Saturday Post article that they wrote. And I noticed in the last blizzard that received, Harold Willis wrote an article about his experiences in the 10th Mountain. And I called Weir Stewart. He lives now a dairy farmer in Vermont. And he was going to come, but his wife just died a month or 2 ago. And I told him about this article that Hal Willis had written, and he was going to look it up in the blizzard because he and Hal were very good friends.
What happened after Yugoslavia?
Oh, well, then they decided that the 10th should come back for a 30-day furlough in the States, and then we were to go to the South Pacific to help in the invasion of Japan. And they took us by rail car down from Villach to Florence, and these were these small railroad cars, and they put about a platoon of men in each one, They used to haul horses at them and things like that. If we came to a small town and the train stopped, a lot of the GIs would get out and then they'd toot the horn, and most of the GIs would get back, but if they didn't, they had to hold the train until they could get them all back on. A couple of the GIs had Italian girlfriends with them. I guess the girls thought they were going to be able to come back to America with the boys, but that was a strange episode. I'm sure some of the other guys in Fox Company maybe have told about that. But after we got back to Florence, they took us over to Livorno, and we went on I think it was a Liberty ship, and came back to Hampton Roads, and we separated and went home for 30 days. Oh, on the boat, while we were coming back, they dropped the first A-bomb. And this was just amazing. We didn't have any idea anything like this was going to happen. And on the way home, by train, the second bomb was dropped. And I went to Camp McCoy and got my papers to go on furlough. And the night I got home, the Japanese had surrendered. And I was too tired to go into Minneapolis and celebrate with my sister. I guess I must have thought they were going to have more celebrations. But this was in early September, as I remember, or late August. Well, then the 10th was to assemble out at Colorado Springs. And I talked my way into staying at Camp McCoy because, what happened with the 10th, I think they were disbanded in November, and I worked at Camp McCoy discharging GIs until February of '46 when I was given my discharge.
Did you continue your military career?
Well, after I used the GI Bill to graduate, one of my friends said if I went out to Fort Snelling, I could get a commission. And the Berlin airlift was going on at this time. And I thought, well, maybe I'll be an officer in the next go-around if we have a deal. So I went out to Fort Snelling and went before a three-man board. And they accepted my request to be an officer. And I was appointed a second lieutenant. And about 2 weeks later, the North Koreans came across the 38th parallel. I was about sick to my stomach when I heard that. And I was in the active reserves in the 5th Army then for 8 years and had training. I became a first lieutenant, and after 8 years I decided that I'd had enough, and they gave me a discharge. And that was the end of my Army career.
And then Dwight Williams, who was the one who gave the talk at your high school.
Oh, yes. Dwight he had climbed through the mountains around Lake Garda, and he was killed the same day that Colonel Darby was in Turboli, which had been cleaned out, but an 88 shell had came in and got Darby, and I don't know just how Dwight was killed. There were two other of my schoolmates. Well, I mean, they graduated from the same school that I had. They were in the 10th Mountain, so there were 4 of us from Blake School. One was a medic in the regiment in the 85th, a line company, and the oldest of the 4 of us was an aide to General Hayes. He had come with General Hayes from the 2nd Infantry Division down to Camp Swift, and he was his aide de camp the entire campaign, and he was a captain. And the strange part was he was in my brother's class in high school. I graduated from the same class. His name was Tom Humphreys, and the medic was Leonard Eaton.
What does it mean to you to have been in the 10th Mountain Division?
Well, I was very proud of my experience with the 10th Mountain Division. It was. I didn't feel that we were too much different than a couple of the other divisions that were in Italy. The 85th and the 88th and the 34th all had a big part in closing out the war. We did make that big run with Darby as our head, the 86th, all the way from the Po River up to Lake Garda, which I was proud of that.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, as far as the 86th 10th Mountain Association, when the war was over, I never heard anything about the 10th Mountain Association, and then about the middle of 1985, I read an obituary in the paper, and in the obituary it mentioned that this fellow had been in the 10th Mountain Division. So a few days later, I called his widow, and she told me what a marvelous group the North Central 10th Mountain Association was. And she told me the name of our president. So I called, and I joined the 10th Mountain Division Association, and I took my wife, who was well at that time, and we went to, besides going to the regional association meetings, we went to French Lick to the national meeting, and that was a lot of fun. That was down near Louisville. Ran into quite a few more Fox Company members than were here for this one, because, of course, that was back in the before 1990. And then in '92, Gene and I went out to Vail, Colorado, for the 10th Mountain's 50th reunion. And Vail was founded by one of the members of Fox Company, Pete Seibert, who'd been wounded in March with us. He'd been in the Aspen Ski School with Friedel Pfeiffer, and he was encouraged by Friedel Pfeiffer to go find his own ski area. And then he and a few other 10th Mountain men went over near where the Eisenhower Tunnel is now, Vail, and bought this farmland and started Vail. And the biggest run in Vail is called Riva Ridge Run, which Pete Seibert was a sergeant and was real active in Fox Company. At the Vail meeting, Pete Seibert told our association about Beaver Creek, I think. There's another resort right next to Vail, and he said we better go over and check that out because of the hotel that's there and the bar. He says it's a lot better bar than was down in the old Sheldon or the Munn Hotel. And but while we were there at Vail, Gene and I had a chance to go to Tennessee Pass and see the monument that had been put up, and drive around Leadville, and it was a good experience. I guess that's about all I have at this point. I don't know how long I've been reminiscing, but I appreciate having a chance to talk. Thank you. How long did I talk? Oh.
43 minutes and 35 seconds.
23?
43.
43. Holy
Yay,
Toledo.
did it. Good job.
You know, I forgot to mention, at the Dr. Deutsch series in...
Come back here. Tell me what?
Dr. Deutsch series at Fort Snelling, they had a history professor from Texas come up who had been in the 10th Mountain, and he had this book he showed, and the climb on Riva Ridge was one of the 100 greatest surprise attacks of all time. So I got that book out of the library and took a copy of this sheet, and I have it for proof. So that I don't know if you knew that, but that was.
That's great.
Yeah, we were supposed to have 90% casualties, and we had just a small number compared. Well, thank you for being a host, and I'm so sorry about your dad.
My pleasure.
I wish
Thank
he'd
you.
been here. And how old were you when you started? 3 years.
So
Your
I-
siblings too?
I basically have my college.
You have brothers and sisters?
at the time. Now I have a brother and a sister. My mother remarried to Tilson. My name was Murphy.
Okay.
Well, thank you for joining us, Bernie. And I feel very, very sorry that your dad didn't
Well,
get you. Where was
you know
he
what?
killed?
You know
On
what?
April 14th, he must have been right there near me.
Right near you.
Boy, that was bad there.
You know what? Let me
Watch out.
do something here. I was going to ask you
Okay. No.
Mm-hmm.
My complete name is Oliver James Barr III. And it's just like it sounds, the name Barr is B-A-R-R.
Okay. And the highest rank served in the 10th Mountain Division?
First Lieutenant.
How about if you start by telling me a little bit about how you were at Dartmouth and then how you came to be in the 10th?
Yeah, that was kind of a sucker move, but it's kind of a fun story. I had a very good friend named John Montaigne. You may know of him. Was a professor of geology in Bozeman, Montana, still lives there. And Charlie McLean was considered the first man into the 10th Mountain Division. You may have heard that he reported, and he said he reporting to the 10th Mountain Division, and the sergeant said, "Son, you are the 10th Mountain Division." That was Charlie McLean. And he wrote back glowing letters to John Montaigne about skiing on Mount Rainier, living at Paradise Lodge. After a day of skiing in deep powder, they would go back to the lodge and beautiful waitresses would join them drinking beer, singing songs, and all of that. Well, after a few of those letters from McLean, John and I both decided, well, that sounds like a pretty good way to fight a war. So we both signed up.
How many Dartmouth boys were there?
In the 10th, I think about 150. As I mentioned, Ken McDonald may have the complete list. Well, I was at Dartmouth, and a good friend of mine, John Montaigne, was a good friend of Charlie McLean, who was reputedly the first man in the 10th Division. And Charlie wrote back these glowing letters about the, you better hold up. That sun is really...
Oh, do you want me to move you a little bit? I was trying to use the sun as a big light. That's
What?
I was trying to do. I can, how about if I move you at a little more of an angle? And then you can look.
That would help.
Yeah. So I'll move you. You don't even have to do more than just scoot your chair towards me. And where this cup is, it will
See
be
that?
where your
Yeah,
chair is.
that'll be worse because the sun is right there.
But it will be not
Can
in
I-
your eyes.
I think it will. See, I'll be facing
Like you'll be facing me. Is it
this
better
way.
now? Yeah.
Oh yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. So now what are you suggesting?
I'm just gonna have you just
Turn?
stand up and yeah. I'm gonna move your whole chair. Okay. You're back.
Yeah, that'll, I'm sure, be better.
Yeah. I don't want to get in the cloth. Take a few breaths.
Yeah. Thank you.
I could use a little bit of that myself.
Take a swig.
All right. Will it take 10 years off my life? Does that explain?
I
your
don't
good
think so.
skin tone?
I don't think so.
I know people like to sniff oxygen because it's supposed to keep them young.
Football players do too.
Yeah, I heard Michael Jackson did it too.
That could be.
Because your body gets more oxygen and.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, I won't. I promise I won't belabor this too long. But you know, one thing I will do is I'll ask you some semi-standard things and then some stuff that I know that I want to make sure I talk to you about Mussolini's villa.
Okay.
Because that's what Tom Haynes and I talked about. And then I always ask if there's more things that you know later on you'll wish you had mentioned. So that's kind of how I run these. Most of them can run an hour or 2 hours, but it's whatever you want it to be, really.
If I put on dark glasses, would that ruin it?
Why don't you put them on? Let's see.
That helps a lot.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. That's absolutely fine. I don't want you to melt. Only bad witches melt. All right.
Yeah, Charlie McLean,
Right.
who was a Dartmouth class of 41, maybe even 40. But anyway, he was the first man in the 10th Mountain Division, theoretically at least. And he wrote this John Montaigne, these glowing letters about skiing on Mount Rainier and how beautiful it was. And then they would go back to Paradise Lodge, where they were put up in nice buildings. And they would have nice dinners served by beautiful waitresses. And then they would drink beer and sing songs and have a wonderful time after that. So, you know, John and I both sounded like that's a pretty good way to fight a war. So we both signed up, and a lot of Dartmouth guys did.
Did you feel like those letters were accurate?
Well, they were accurate at the time, but we knew, of course, that that was temporary. And in fact, by the time I arrived at Fort Lewis in June, the troops had come down from Mount Rainier. So the only skiing I did at Mount Rainier was on weekends. But I went up several times, skied with Bob Parker a lot, who was active in Vail later. And on one of those occasions, I almost got killed because I came across a crevasse, and it wasn't marked in any way, and it just opened up in front of me, and all I could do was jump. Luckily, I could jump far enough to get over the end of the crevasse and land in the snow. But I was scared, and Bob was scared, and we never went there again.
Oh my gosh.
It's hard to say what kind of an experience it was, but it certainly was one of the most important experiences of our lives. The whole thing, training and combat.
Why?
Well, it was very unusual. The ordinary person would never do what we were doing, either in training or in combat. So, with all of one of the things about a group of men, probably women, is that the worse the conditions you put them in, the higher their spirits. And so a lot of the time we had wonderful spirits. All of the guys were pals, you know, and it was just a wonderful atmosphere to be in.
Now, when you had the easiest conditions, do you think that kind of contributed to sort of depressed spirits?
Well, in a way, I have a story about that, and that is on one hike, I was leading my platoon up into the mountains, and everybody was grousing and grumbling, and a couple of the guys even refused to go on until I practically kicked them in the tail. And but we kept going, and then it started to rain cats and dogs. Well, you should have seen the change. All of a sudden, that whole platoon, instead of grousing and grumbling, was happy, laughing, singing, having a marvelous time, because all of us were facing a hardship together. And it was a remarkable experience and lesson to me, because if you put people in a difficult situation, they're going to respond as well as they can.
Well, that's an interesting observation. I never heard that before.
Yeah, it's true though. Yeah. These guys, they were all grumbling, as I say. A couple of them wouldn't go on. Unfortunately, they were Dartmouth men. But when it started to rain, I tell you, the whole group. And then we got into camp. It was typical for a group like that. When they came to camp, they would kind of form up, try to look real good, and double time into camp. You know, impress the people with, boy, look at these guys. They've been out on a 10, 15-mile hike. They come double timing into camp. Boy, look at that. So when we got there, they all did that, and we're all pretty tickled.
Now, when you think back about your letters of recommendation, can you recall who gave you letters of recommendation and what they said?
Yeah, I can. A classmate at Dartmouth was a fellow named Bob Billings, who owned the Brattleboro Hotel in Vermont. The Brattleboro Hotel was a hot spot for skiing in Vermont at that time. And so Bob gave me one recommendation, and then his brother Les Billings gave me another. And then there was a fellow named Mezzie Barber, who at that time was the national alpine champion, which is a combination of jump and cross country, just those two. Unusual event. And Mezzie was the alpine champion that year, and he wrote the third one.
You know, it was in
Well, yeah, they all lied a little bit, you know, and said what a great skier I was. I would say that I was a high intermediate at best. They made it sound like I was pretty professional, but I was high intermediate.
What was it that really made you want to be in the 10th more than anything else?
Well, first I tried to get into the Air Corps, and I couldn't do it because I wore glasses. And then I thought, well, the Navy would be nice, and the Navy wouldn't take me either. They had some great programs, the Air Corps and the Navy, and you would go to school for a while, and when you came out, you would either be a second lieutenant or an ensign. But I couldn't do that either. But I did love skiing, and so that was what I'd say it was my third choice, but it turned out really well.
What do you think is the value of saving all these memories of men who served in the 10th?
Well, they're memories that the ordinary person in the ordinary course of life would never experience. And so anybody who reads them will be exposed to a whole different set of circumstances than they could ever expect to be in themselves. And I think that would probably be interesting to quite a few people.
Did you have a sense at the time that you were making history? You were saying that your point of view were things that other people didn't normally get to see or hear, but did you have a sense you were making history?
To tell you the truth, I don't think that we gave too much thought to that. I think it was after the war that we realized what a unique division we were in. At the time, most of us really enjoyed the skiing and the outdoor life. I mean, it was something we enjoyed doing, and the training, although it was difficult, was something that we really kind of got a kick out of, even though it was hard. And so I don't think we considered making history because the hundreds of other military units were doing somewhat similar things. And it was after the war, I think, that we realized that this was a unique division. There never was one like it before, and there never will be one like it again. And to that extent, I think we now consider that we did make history.
How do you think you shaped history?
Well, I suppose it goes back to the Finnish troops, Finland, when they were fighting Russia. A handful of Finnish troops in white ski outfits fought off much superior forces for a long time in Finland. And then when they started our division, we were capable of fighting in areas and fighting fairly easily and fairly well and efficiently that I don't think any other division could have fought in. And to that extent, yeah, we probably shaped a little history that way. We could fight in steep terrain, mountain terrain, where there were no roads. It didn't make any difference. We could go almost anywhere easily, quickly, and fight efficiently.
How do you think it personally shaped your life?
Well, it shaped my life because we trained here in Colorado. And Jean and I, my wife, got married in April of 1943, when I graduated from Officers Candidate School. So I was married all the time, most of the time that I was out here. And we both loved it so that we came back, and we've lived here ever since. And if it had not been for that, I probably would have lived in the East where I grew up.
Did you have a sense that you were going to know these people the rest of your life?
To some extent. Some of them, of course, you know, in a 15,000-man division, you certainly don't know everybody. And you know some of them very well. And the ones that came back to this area, yes, we figured, yes, we would know them the rest of our life. But the nice thing is that we've met many, many men since and have known them all the rest of our lives since we met them. And so we have a much broader base of friends than we started with right after the war. It's been a wonderful experience.
One of the things Tom Hames wanted to make sure that I got you to talk about was how your role in the whole Mussolini's villa thing. I understood that you and Gene Hames served together.
No, that isn't quite correct, Abby. At the time of the Mussolini deal, I was in the hospital. I got wounded. Authority has its benefits. The general told Gene Hames, don't touch anything. And so he ordered his men not to touch anything, and he did his very best to enforce that. So then after 2 or 3 days, the general comes over with an empty duck, fills it up with souvenirs from Mussolini's villa, and rides on back. At that point, Gene said to his men, hell, take what you want. And so they each took various things. 1 or 2 of them were nice enough to give me a little souvenir later when I got out of the hospital, but I didn't collect any at the time. And one of the interesting things is that Mussolini had a mistress called Clara Petacci. And I think everybody remembers the scene of Mussolini and Clara Petacci hanging by their heels in the square, I think it was in Milan. And one of the more proper Italians took her skirt and tucked it between her legs in a more modest fashion than it was hanging before. But anyway, Clara Petacci had a collection of dolls that every woman in Italy knew about and every woman in Italy wanted to see. They called them Bambini Petacci. And one of the guys was smart enough to latch on to 3 or 4 of these Bambini Petacci. And wherever we went after that, he was swamped with Italian women who wanted to see some of the Bambini Petacci.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. When you were in the worst of conditions, what was it that pulled you through?
In combat?
Mm-hmm.
I think that for me and for most of the guys, it was just a knowledge that we were expected to pull through. We were expected to support the guy on the right, the guy on the left, whatever it was, and we didn't want to let anybody down. So I think it was mostly just that we knew it was expected. We didn't want to let the other guys down, and we just did it. It was nerve-wracking. If you can imagine a German maybe 100 yards away up on a hill, you can't see him. In the movies, you can always see the enemy, not in war. The Germans, you couldn't tell where they were, but they had machine guns, they had all kinds of other weapons, and here you were walking across an open field, and you had to get up to that hill and kill enough Germans so you could take that hill. Well, to climb out of a safe position and do that took an awful lot of guts. And I think all of the guys who did that, in my opinion, they were heroes.
What was your most memorable battle experience?
Well, that was definitely Mont Belvedere, because Mont Belvedere was the first major attack that the division pulled. And the 3rd Battalion of the 85th was assigned the peak of Mont Belvedere, and I led that attack all the way to the peak. So that, as far as I know, I was the first man to get to the extreme peak of the mountain that night, about 3 a.m., I would say. And then the next day, I engaged a sniper in fire, drove him to cover, and then I went into the German bunkers and captured him and the other Germans that were still hiding there. So that experience was definitely my most important contribution to the war.
What were you thinking when you did it?
Well, I guess I was hoping more than thinking that all those bullets and all those shells wouldn't hit me. And fortunately they didn't. They did hit a lot of the guys, and like your uncle, was it? They hit him. But they didn't hit me then, and I moved straight up I ran into a machine gun on the way up, and I knocked that out with a grenade. And later I ran into barbed wire, which I crawled under. Later I was almost up at the top, and heavy shelling came in. And that really is terrifying because the shelling was coming directly from a position on Mount Gorgolesco. So it was direct fire onto our positions. And I huddled in a ditch for a little while. And then when the shelling let up, I moved up to the very top of the mountain and got into the German observation trench, which was at the very peak. And it was a lovely position to be in. Germans make very nice trenches, and once I was in that, I felt pretty safe. But they could have come over the top at me, so all night I was kind of worried, and I was keeping an eye on the top, and I had my rifle ready. You know, I'm sure you've heard this story. We were ordered not to load the weapons. But when I got up there, I did load the weapon. And all night long, I kept an eye on that little knoll that was between me and them, expecting some to come over, maybe a lot. But none came. And in the next morning, George Dorrington, the battalion S3, said, "Jim, there's a sniper there." And he didn't say any more than that, but I could tell he wanted me to do something about it. So I got in behind, there's a stone on the top of the hill. I got behind that and opened fire on this sniper. And I didn't hit him. On one occasion I knew about where he was going to pop up his head, you know, because he'd pop up and down quickly. Pretty hard to hit that. But I had my rifle, it was a carbine, aimed directly at the spot where I thought his head would come up, and it did. And I squeezed the trigger, and it misfired. Oh, what a sickening sound. And that little fraction of a second gave him a chance to get a pretty good shot at me. And he put a bullet very close to me, and I had a rifleman with a grenade launcher beside me. I called for him soon after I got there, and he was there, and the bullet kind of went in between the two of us, but we were both lucky that that misfire didn't cause one of us to get hurt.
Did you feel that the Germans were pretty surprised when you got to the top?
Not at that point. They were surprised a little bit earlier in the night. They were surprised that that we were attacking at that time and in the middle of the night, and for all practical purposes we were soundless. And here they are sitting there, no sound, but they know that troops are sneaking up on them little by little. And at that point I think they probably got pretty worried. And as I say, when I got to the top, the observation trench, which should have been manned, was completely empty. So I could jump into it and get that protection. So it was earlier in the evening that I think that the defending troops were surprised. And Field Marshal Kesselring, have you heard of his quote? He made a statement saying that much to my surprise, the remarkable American 10th Mountain Division attacked Mount Belvedere in deep snow and in the night and quickly captured Belvedere. That's a paraphrase. And so it was unexpected by him and unexpected by those troops.
How did you feel climbing up Mount Belvedere with unloaded weapon?
Well, I didn't like it, and I don't think many of the guys did. You felt a little bit naked. You know, the only thing you had was grenades. They would allow us to throw grenades. But you can only throw a grenade so far, and a rifle or a carbine can reach much further. So I think most of us would have preferred to have been the right to fire those weapons. But the general knew that if we did fire them, the flash would give away our position, and we would be in worse shape than if we didn't do it. So I think his decision was right.
The day after Mount Belvedere, what happened to you?
Well, the attack started at 11 o'clock at night, and that was on February 19th. The day after that was February 20th, and that was the day on which we completed the consolidation of the peak, and I captured the remaining Germans in the bunkers. After that, we just took up defensive positions because quite often the Germans would counterattack, and they did not do so. And then later in the afternoon, the 3rd Battalion was moved over behind Mount Gorgolesco, and the 87th Regiment took over the peak.
Did you feel a sense of relief to be out of the lead temporarily?
Well, not all that much, Abby, because once we had cleared the peak, we felt fairly safe. Now, that was kind of a false sense of security because they had dozens of 81 millimeter mortars zeroed in on the peak, and they could have dropped them on us at any time. But we didn't consider that too much. You know, a mortar comes in like a little bird. It doesn't go whoosh like you hear an artillery shell. You don't really hear it until you hear a little then you know you better, if you can, find some cover. So they could have dropped mortar shells on us by the hundreds. And our sense of security was a little bit false, but it turned out to be okay.
Do you have any idea why they didn't drop the mortars on you?
No, in fact, I have wondered about that all my life. I think probably since they decided not to counterattack, they decided not to waste the ammunition. If they had counterattacked, they absolutely would have dropped those shells.
How do you think that battle experience pulled your men together?
Well, like any combat experience, I think it pulled them together irretrievably. Once you go through that with friends and comrades, you feel a bond to those guys that you really never felt before. We did feel close to them. We trained a long time together. We did feel close. But once you've gone through a combat situation like that, you feel closer. But actually, I was a little bit shocked. And I think a lot of the guys were. I mean, I had been in this nice German trench, but at about 4:30 or so in the morning, maybe 5, hundreds of shells came in, mortar shells, on the back slope and landed among our men. And they were screaming and moaning and crying, and it was a terrible sound. And actually, that affected me quite a little bit, so much so that the following day, the battalion commander said to one of the other officers, don't you get funny too? In other words, I was acting a little strange because I was so shocked by it. It only took a day or two to get over it, but at that time it was really quite a shocking experience.
How do you think the perspective of the regular infantry soldier differs from an officer's in battle?
Well, the officer feels more responsibility. The first and second lieutenants are called leaders. They are called platoon leaders. And that word is well chosen because they are meant to lead. And the officers who are first or second lieutenants do lead, and the casualties among the first and second lieutenants is the highest of anything in the military because they are out front. That doesn't mean that the men who follow aren't brave, don't risk their necks and don't get shot a lot, but it does mean that they depend on somebody being in front of them. Just like on the night attack on Belvedere, everybody was following me, but there was nobody for me to follow. And it's kind of a similar thing.
Can you talk a little bit about, after Mount Belvedere, what your next battle engagement was?
Yeah, the next battle engagement was probably Mount Della Spey. there were battles well, no, I take that back. The big battle in between there was Della Terraccia. Mount Belvedere was at the left end of a long ridge. Della Terraccia was at the northeast end of that long ridge. And that was a very difficult battle. The 1st Battalion of the 85th had passed through the 2nd Battalion of the 85th had passed through the 1st Battalion of the 85th and continued the attack after Gorgolesco. Belvedere was on the left, Gorgolesco was on the right. They were both very similar mountains, about the same height, and the 1st Battalion had Gorgolesco as its objective. At Gorgolesco, the 2nd Battalion passed through and attacked Della Terraccia. But they ran into terrible, terrible trouble. They got in the trees. The Germans dropped shells into those trees, and the shells burst up in the branches and came straight down so that a foxhole didn't do much good. And an awful lot of officers and men were wiped out. Well, finally, the 2nd Battalion, they got as far as they could, and then they had to give up. And then I believe it was one of the battalions of the 86th that took over and captured Della Terraccia.
And then what was the next big thing that happened to you then?
Well, after that it was Della Spey. There were battles in between, but Mount Della Spey was a very tough one. Our either 1st or 2nd Battalion captured it, and it was a priority for the Germans. And when you got to the top of that hill, I got there a day or so after they had captured it. There was a stench of decaying human flesh. There wasn't a branch or a leaf on any of the trees, and all of the guys had pieces of wood or pieces of tin, whatever they could find, on top of their foxhole to protect against the mortars. So it was a very key location, and the Germans fought very hard, and they did counterattack several times. So that the group that took it, and I can't remember offhand which one was exactly it, they had a bad time.
Did you ever think during these most difficult times that the Americans wouldn't prevail?
No, never occurred to me.
What do you think the core values of the 10th are? What is the spirit of the 10th?
Core values. I think probably the core value is comradeship and loyalty. Probably those two.
What does it mean to you to be 10th?
I'm proud of it, very proud of it, and it means a lot to me.
How has it shaped your life? You said you moved here, but how did it shape your life in other ways, like sort of psychologically?
No, not really. Some of the men, in any group of men, you have some that are very sensitive, and then you have others that are not sensitive at all. And you'll find that anywhere. And I was in the middle, so that the actual experience did not affect me psychologically. Although you might say that it gave me confidence that if I could do that, I could probably do most anything. That would be the only way.
Did it shape you in a positive way in terms of teaching you certain skills that later became valuable to you?
No, except leadership. It did teach leadership skills, handling men, learning that different men have to be handled different ways, and that was very valuable.
Well, as a leader, what was the most difficult thing about leading?
I really, in combat, I can't think of anything that was all that difficult. If I led, they would follow. And I didn't have to argue, I didn't have to give them a pep talk, I didn't have to do anything. I knew that they would follow. Up on the top of Belvedere, when I moved into the German bunkers to capture the remaining. I didn't say a word, but behind me, 6 guys fell in on either side of the trench I was in and followed me down until those Germans came out and surrendered. And I didn't say a word. So I think that leadership in combat is just a matter of leading. Some of the men will follow. Some of the men kind of hang back. And the ones that do the fighting really are probably not more than 50% of the whole group. And those are the ones that will follow. And the others, they just come along later.
How do you think being in that war shaped your attitude towards war in general?
Well, during World War II, I think it was Studs Terkel who wrote a book entitled The Good War. And I think all of us felt that it was the good war. And so I think all of us felt that we were doing the right thing and that we could be proud of our service. How did it shape my attitude since then? I thought the Korean War was extremely important because it showed the Russians we were willing to fight if we had to. The Vietnam War, I didn't like it much better than anybody else. And the Iraq War, I was opposed to it, and I wrote all the congressmen and senators that I could, and I got no answers. But once we were there, the whole situation changed. We are there. We have invested a lot of human life. We have invested a lot of money. We must succeed.
Do you think that's a 10th Mountain attitude in general?
Oh yes, no doubt about it.
When you were back in training, what was the hardest thing you did during training?
I think if you've asked that question to others, you probably got the same answer, and it would be D Series. The D Series, the division series, was the most difficult. We were out in sub-zero temperatures day after day. We never got inside a building. It was rainy, it was snowing. It was really very, very difficult training, and I'm sure that was the most difficult part of training. Of course, in Camp Swift, it was very difficult the first few days to get out in 110-degree temperature and hike, whereas before that we'd been up at Camp Hale in relatively nice, cool weather, and we didn't have to worry about that. But credit has to be given to the bosses. They caught on pretty quickly, and they made the hikes after that at night. So that was.
What did all the toughness of this training teach you personally?
Did what?
What did all the tough assignments during training teach you personally?
Well, it was the same thing that if we could do that, we could do most anything. I did have one really funny story, though, from D Series that I got a big kick out of. And that is that I was leading a patrol. You know, in the D Series, you got the red troops who are enemy, the blue troops, they're the good guys. So I was leading a patrol of the good guys, and we came across a machine gun nest. That was the enemy. And so we spread out, and we started to ski down through the snow and through the trees, attacking this machine gun. And right away, one of the guys hit a tree, another one caught a tip and fell down. I hit something and fell down, another guy fell down, and pretty soon just about all the patrol was floundering in the snow. And then this wise guy machine gun sergeant from the enemy said, "Hold your fire, men, they're going to kill themselves." Well, to me, that was one of the most wonderful examples of military humor you could think of. Hold your fire, men, they're going to kill themselves. Spontaneous, you know, really great.
Do you think most 10th guys had a pretty good sense of humor?
Yes, I think most soldiers, to the extent that they can, have to have. It's the sense of humor can get you through a lot of difficult situations. Yeah, and I do think most of the 10th guys do have a good sense of humor.
What do you think was the difference between the 10th guys and the Flatlanders? Soldiers trained on the Flatlands.
Well, I think I know that the biggest difference was the spirit of unity. You see, we trained together for 3.5 years. No flatland outfit trained for anywhere near that length. My brother-in-law was in the Big Red 1 Division. He trained with them for perhaps 120 days, and then he went over to combat. Well, he hardly knew the guys in the Big Red 1. But we had trained together for years, and so the biggest difference was that we had a great feeling of unity that they did not ever have the chance to develop.
Did you feel like, what do you think caused this sense of unity besides being together that long? Anything?
Well, it's sharing common hardships. When you share common hardships with a bunch of people, it pulls you together. And I don't care whether it's military or private life. Years ago, my wife and I went to Burma, and it was an organized tour, and just about everything went wrong.